History says Al Capone died in 1947. But what if that was just the story they wanted you to believe? What if the most feared gangster in America didn't disappear? He evolved, and now controls the modern underworld. History tells us that Al Capone died a broken man. His mind shattered, his empire gone, his name fading into dusty archives and black and white photographs. A gangster defeated not by bullets, but by time. That's the version we're taught to accept. Clean, final, convenient. But history has a habit of simplifying stories that are far too dangerous to tell in full. Because power like Capone's doesn't just vanish. It adapts, it waits, and sometimes it hides in plain sight. Think about it. Al Capone didn't fall in a shootout. He wasn't betrayed on the street. He wasn't publicly executed. He was declared unfit, quietly moved, slowly erased from relevance. And in a world built on corruption, secrecy, and influence, that kind of ending isn't a failure. It's an opportunity. An opportunity to disappear completely while everyone else assumes the story is over. While the world rebuilt itself after war, while cities grew taller and crime grew smarter, Capone's greatest weapon was no longer fear. It was patience. The underworld changed. Guns became liabilities. Loyalty became transactional. Violence became noisy. And the smartest criminals learned that real control doesn't come from headlines or bloodshed. It comes from leverage, from money, from information, from owning the systems instead of fighting them. What if Al Capone saw that future coming before anyone else? What if the man who once ruled Chicago understood that the next empire wouldn't be built in back alleys or smoke-filled rooms, but in boardrooms, offshore accounts, data centers, and political favors? A world where you don't need to threaten people when you can own what they depend on. A world where the most powerful criminal is the one no one believes exists. Imagine an underworld where rival syndicates collapse without warning, where politicians rise and fall quietly, where companies fail overnight for reasons that never quite make sense. No signatures, no names, just influence moving silently through the cracks of modern society. And at the center of it all, not a flashy kingpin, but a ghost. A man who learned that survival isn't about dominating the moment, but outlasting history itself. This isn't a story about nostalgia or glorifying the past. This is about evolution, about how crime doesn't disappear. It upgrades, and about how the most dangerous figures aren't the ones we remember, but the ones we stopped looking for. Because when the world stops watching, that's when real power has room to grow. So tonight, we're not asking whether Al Capone could survive the modern world. We're asking something far more unsettling. What if the modern underworld was built by someone who already knew how to rule it, long before the rest of us even realized the game had changed? The world remembers Al Capone at the moment of his collapse, the headlines frozen in time, the mugshots, the courtroom sketches. The narrative ends there because it's comfortable, because it feels like justice. A monster defeated, a chapter closed. But history is rarely written by those who understand power. It's written by those who need closure. And closure is often just another form of control. By the time Al Capone was sentenced to Alcatraz, the myth had already begun to crack. Not because he had lost his grip on Chicago, but because he had learned something far more dangerous than dominance. He had learned restraint. Capone watched as louder men rose and fell, chasing attention like oxygen, unaware that visibility was becoming a weakness. The streets were changing. The world was changing. And the smartest predators were no longer hunting in the open. Prison was not the end people imagined. It was a pause, a forced silence, a place where Capone could observe without being observed. While guards believed they were watching a broken man, Capone was watching systems. Who controlled supplies? Who spoke to whom? Which rules bent under pressure and which ones shattered completely when money entered the equation? Even inside concrete walls, the mechanics of power remained the same. That lesson stayed with him. When doctors declared his mind deteriorated, the world nodded in agreement. Syphilis had eaten away at the great gangster's brain, they said. He was no longer a threat, but mental decline is a convenient diagnosis in a system that prefers clean explanations. Medical reports were sealed. Transfers were undocumented. Names were changed. And in the chaos of post-war bureaucracy, one more file slipped into darkness without resistance. Capone didn't walk out into freedom. He was escorted into obscurity, a controlled disappearance, a vanishing act financed by favors owed, debts unpaid, and loyalties never fully severed. Men who had once feared him now protected him, not out of devotion, but because Capone understood something they didn't, that the safest place for power is where no one thinks to look. For years, nothing happened. No sightings, no whispers, no sudden movements in the criminal world that could be traced to a single source. And that was the point. Capone had already ruled one era by force. He wasn't interested in repeating the same mistake. He studied quietly as the world rebuilt itself on new foundations. Governments expanded. Corporations grew larger than nations. Money stopped smelling like blood and started smelling like ink and paper. Crime followed the same path. Smuggling routes turned into logistics networks. Bribes became campaign donations. Enforcers traded guns for suits. And Capone saw what others missed. The underworld wasn't dying. It was professionalizing, becoming abstract, becoming safe for those who knew how to hide behind legitimacy. From a distance, Capone began to invest. Not directly, never directly. Shell companies layered inside other shell companies. Small stakes, no patterns, no attention. He didn't need to control everything. He needed to understand everything. Banking loopholes, tax shelters, the quiet language of influence spoken in private rooms far from the street. He let younger criminals fight over territory while he learned how to own the ground beneath it. By the time the digital age arrived, Capone was no longer a man clinging to survival. He was an idea embedded in systems. He understood that data was more valuable than loyalty and silence more powerful than fear. Violence left evidence, information erased it, and those who controlled information could destroy empires without ever pulling a trigger. He watched entire crime families disappear, not through massacres, but through audits, arrests, and internal collapse. Nobody ever connected the dots because there were no dots to connect, just consequences. Capone never issued orders the way he once had. He influenced outcomes, nudged events, allowed people to believe they were acting on their own ideas. The most effective leaders don't command. They shape reality so others move exactly where they want. To the modern underworld, he was never a name. He was a function, a pressure, a force that corrected imbalance. When a syndicate grew too loud, it collapsed. When a politician crossed an invisible line, scandals emerged. When corporations needed protection, protection arrived through regulations and competitors quietly removed from the board. Capone had become something far more dangerous than a kingpin. He had become invisible, and that invisibility was intentional, because Capone knew the truth that every empire eventually learns too late. The moment people believe they know who you are, you've already lost. So he erased himself completely, leaving behind only results, only patterns too subtle to notice, only a world that felt increasingly controlled by something no one could see. This was not revenge. It wasn't nostalgia. It was evolution. Capone didn't want to relive his glory days. He wanted to outgrow them, to exist beyond myth, beyond history, beyond the reach of anyone still chasing the ghosts of old gangsters with new weapons. By the time anyone would begin asking the wrong questions, by the time investigators would notice that too many threads led nowhere, Al Capone was already gone again. Not dead, not hiding, just somewhere no one thought to look. In a world obsessed with exposure, he had discovered the ultimate power, being completely forgotten while controlling everything that mattered. And this was only the beginning. By the time the world realized crime had changed, it was already too late to trace who had changed it first. The streets no longer belonged to men with guns and reputations. They belonged to spreadsheets, legal loopholes, and people who never appeared in photographs. The underworld didn't announce its evolution. It slipped into it quietly, wearing the face of legitimacy. And somewhere inside that transition, Al Capone found his second birth. The first rule of the modern era was simple: noise attracts consequences. Capone had learned that lesson the hard way decades earlier. Now he watched as new criminals repeated the same mistakes, flaunting wealth, chasing status, mistaking attention for power. They built empires that looked impressive from the outside but were hollow at the core. One investigation, one leak, one wrong alliance, and they vanished. Capone didn't feel sympathy. He felt confirmation. He began shaping the world the way a chess player controls a board without touching every piece. He never funded operations outright. He created conditions, a loan here, a partnership there, a regulation quietly delayed, a competitor suddenly audited. People believed they were succeeding on their own, never realizing the path beneath their feet had been carefully arranged. Capone understood that the greatest illusion of power is freedom. Money was the language of the new underworld, and Capone became fluent. Not flashy wealth, quiet capital, funds that moved through pensions, charities, real estate trusts, and foreign banks with names no one bothered to pronounce. He didn't chase profits for their own sake. He chased positioning, influence over infrastructure, control over bottlenecks, ports, networks, supply chains, places where everything had to pass through eventually. He learned quickly that governments were not enemies. They were partners who didn't know they were cooperating. Politicians came and went, but systems endured. Laws could be bent, delayed, softened, or weaponized depending on who whispered into the right ears at the right time. Capone never needed to threaten anyone. Fear was inefficient. Leverage was permanent. The digital age didn't frighten him, it liberated him. Where others saw complexity, Capone saw distance. Distance from accountability, distance from consequence. Crime no longer needed a face, it needed access. Servers replaced warehouses, data replaced territory. Identity itself became flexible, disposable, renewable, and Capone embraced it like a man finally speaking his native tongue again. Entire criminal networks unknowingly operated inside structures he had helped design. When they succeeded, he profited. When they failed, he learned. He let chaos play out as long as it served him, then corrected it when necessary. Balance mattered. Too much instability drew attention. Too much order bred ambition. The underworld needed tension, just enough to keep everyone distracted from the truth. Rumors began circulating among people who lived in the margins, not about a man, but about a presence. Deals that always seemed to work out for certain groups. Investigations that stalled for no obvious reason. Rivals who collapsed overnight due to internal betrayals no one could explain. It felt less like competition and more like correction, as if an unseen hand was pruning a tree before it grew out of control. Capone never corrected those rumors. He let them mutate. Fear without a target is one of the most powerful tools imaginable. People behave carefully when they believe something is watching, even if they don't know what it is. And Capone understood psychology better than any modern profiler. He had built his first empire on human weakness. His second was built on human assumption. Occasionally, someone would get too close, a curious analyst, an investigator who noticed patterns where none were supposed to exist. Capone never silenced them violently. That was crude. Instead, their careers drifted. Their funding dried up. Their credibility eroded. Some were promoted into irrelevance. Others were buried under paperwork and internal politics until they gave up on the questions entirely. The system protected itself because it didn't realize it was compromised. Age, ironically, became Capone's greatest camouflage. The idea that someone from the early 20th century could navigate modern crime felt absurd to most people. They assumed intelligence aged poorly. That experience became outdated. They were wrong. Capone had lived through prohibition, war, collapse, reinvention. He understood cycles. Technology changed the tools, not the instincts. Greed, fear, ambition, denial, those never evolved. He no longer thought of himself as a gangster. That identity belonged to another life, another man. This version of Capone didn't need recognition. He didn't even need to survive in the conventional sense. His influence was already distributed, embedded in contracts, algorithms, legal frameworks that would outlive him. He had done what every ruler dreams of, but few achieve. He made himself unnecessary. And yet, beneath all the strategy and patience, there was something else, not regret, not nostalgia, but awareness. Capone knew that power without a witness eventually becomes meaningless. So he allowed whispers, let legends resurface in distorted forms. Old photos shared online, half-serious theories dismissed as conspiracy. He enjoyed the irony of truth hidden inside disbelief. The safest place for a secret is inside a joke. By the time law enforcement agencies began talking quietly among themselves, by the time they noticed that too many unrelated operations pointed toward the same invisible absence, the trail had already gone cold. It always had been. There was no Capone to find, no fingerprints, no bank accounts with his name, no body to exhume, just a pattern of outcomes that suggested intelligence far older and far more disciplined than anything they were used to facing. Capone didn't fear exposure. He welcomed the attempt because he knew something they didn't, that the world no longer had the tools to fight something that wasn't illegal, wasn't violent, and wasn't visible. You can arrest a man. You can dismantle an organization. But how do you fight a design? And so the modern underworld continued to function efficient and silent while people argued over myths and ghosts, while documentaries speculated and headlines chased distractions. Al Capone remained exactly where he wanted to be, absent, unquestioned, and everywhere at once. The empire he built the first time was loud enough to echo through history. The second was quiet enough to control it. The first real threat didn't come from the streets or rival syndicates. It came from patterns, quiet ones, the kind that only emerge when enough data is stacked on top of itself and someone finally asks the wrong question. For decades, Capone's world had operated like a perfectly tuned machine, self-correcting, adaptive, invisible. But every system, no matter how elegant, eventually attracts attention from someone who doesn't care about reputation or fear, only consistency. It began with anomalies, financial crimes that never quite fit the expected profile, criminal networks that collapsed without violence, investigations that reached a critical point and then dissolved into nothing, not because of corruption, but because the trail simply ended. No resistance, no obstruction, just absence. To most analysts, these were unrelated events. To a few, they felt intentional. A small task force was assembled, unofficial at first. No press, no announcements, just a handful of people from different agencies who shared the same discomfort, the sense that something old was operating inside something new. They didn't start by chasing suspects. They chased effects. Who benefited when a cartel imploded? Who moved into the vacuum when a corporation failed? Who always seemed insulated from consequences no matter how close they drifted to disaster? The answers didn't lead to a person. They led to architecture. Capone had anticipated this long ago. That was the advantage of time. He knew eventually someone would notice the absence where chaos should have been. So he built layers not just to hide himself, but to make discovery useless. Even if they understood the shape of the machine, they would never find the hand that built it. He watched the investigation the way a surgeon watches a patient wake up, calm, curious, detached. Information flowed to him the same way it always had, through channels no one thought to question. He didn't intervene immediately. Overreaction was a mistake. Let them look. Let them think. The deeper they went, the more convinced they would become that what they were hunting couldn't possibly exist. That was the paradox he relied on. Modern intelligence depended on speed, automation, predictive models. Capone operated on patience and human behavior. Algorithms searched for spikes. He lived in plateaus. Systems flagged aggression. He specialized in restraint. Every move he made looked like noise because it was designed to resemble normality. Still, curiosity has momentum. The task force began building a profile, not of a man, but of a mind. Whoever was behind this didn't seek dominance in the traditional sense. They sought equilibrium. They removed threats that destabilized the ecosystem. They allowed minor conflicts to play out while preventing wars. It was less like crime and more like governance. That realization unsettled them far more than any cartel ever could. One analyst, younger than the rest, noticed something no one else had: a temporal anomaly. The patterns didn't just span continents. They spanned generations. The logic behind certain decisions felt outdated, conservative, almost archaic in its patience. Whoever this was had learned power in a different era, one where mistakes were fatal and trust was expensive. The methods were modern, but the instincts were old. When that theory was floated, it was laughed off. Criminal empires didn't last that long. People didn't last that long. History didn't work that way. Capone smiled when he heard that. He had built his second life on that assumption, the belief that time invalidates experience, that survival is luck, not strategy. He considered ending the investigation quietly. A few phone calls, a few redirected careers, but something held him back. Not arrogance, curiosity. He wanted to see how far they would go, how close they could get without realizing the truth had been standing in front of them the entire time. The closer they came, the more fragmented the picture became. Leads contradicted each other. Timelines refused to align. Every hypothesis collapsed under its own logic. Eventually, frustration replaced confidence. Funding slowed. Support weakened. The task force shrank. And just like that, the system began correcting itself again. Capone understood that exposure didn't always require action. Sometimes all you had to do was nothing and let doubt do the work for you. Institutions hate uncertainty. They prefer wrong answers to unanswered questions. And when a certainty disappears, attention moves elsewhere. Still, one file remained open, unofficial, unlabeled, a collection of notes and theories no one wanted to sign off on. In it was a single line written late one night, more thought than conclusion. This doesn't feel like crime. It feels like succession. That word lingered longer than any accusation ever could. Capone had outlived his enemies. He had outlived his peers. He had even outlived the version of the world that created him. And now, quietly, he was outliving the need to exist at all. His presence had been reduced to influence alone. Decisions made by people who believed they were acting independently. Systems correcting themselves because they had been taught how. He began preparing for the final transition. Not death. Disappearance at a deeper level. He distributed what remained of his direct involvement, dissolving the last threads that could ever be traced back to a single origin. The underworld didn't need him anymore. That was the point. True power is knowing when you are no longer required. On a secure screen, in a room no one knew existed, Capone watched the world continue without him. Markets fluctuated, governments argued, criminals rose and fell. The machine functioned exactly as designed, balanced, quiet, unaware of its creator. He felt no pride, no regret, only certainty. The world would continue debating ghosts, chasing shadows, romanticizing villains who burned bright and died fast. They would never look for the ones who learned to dim the lights and stay forever. History would remember Al Capone as a cautionary tale, a relic of a louder time. And that was fine, because the greatest trick he ever pulled wasn't surviving. It was convincing the world that survival like his was impossible. The first crack didn't come from law enforcement. It came from the underworld itself. For years, balance had been maintained so subtly that no one questioned it. Conflicts resolved themselves. Markets corrected. Loud operators burned out while quieter ones thrived. The system felt natural, almost organic. But power, no matter how carefully managed, eventually breeds impatience. A new generation had risen, faster, louder, raised on instant success and digital reach. They didn't fear myths. They mocked them. They wanted proof. These weren't street criminals chasing territory. They were financiers, traffickers of data, architects of influence. who believed the old rules no longer applied. To them, secrecy was outdated. Visibility was leverage. And they began pushing against limits they didn't understand, testing boundaries that had never been meant to move. At first, Capone ignored them. Disruption was part of evolution. But this wasn't chaos. It was arrogance. They moved too fast, drew attention, collapsed safeguards that had taken decades to build. They believed they were smarter because they were newer, younger, untethered from history. That assumption had destroyed empires before. Capone had watched it happen in his first life. So he intervened. Not directly, never directly. A funding source evaporated. A partnership failed to materialize. A legal gray area suddenly hardened into law. These were corrections, not punishments. Signals meant to warn, not destroy. But the new players didn't recognize restraint as mercy. They mistook it for weakness. And that was dangerous. One faction began mapping the invisible structure beneath the underworld, not out of curiosity, but ambition. They wanted to replace it, to sit where no one had ever sat. They didn't believe in ghosts. They believed in systems. And systems, they assumed, could be taken over. Capone watched as they pulled at threads, each one designed to unravel into nothing. He had built redundancies upon redundancies, layers meant to collapse safely if disturbed. But persistence has a weight of its own. Eventually, someone stumbles not onto the truth, but close enough to feel it. That was when Capone made the decision he had delayed for decades. He would be seen. Not publicly, not historically, but unmistakably. The message wasn't delivered with words. It was delivered with consequence. In less than a month, the faction unraveled completely. Not through arrests, not through violence, through exposure, so precise it felt surgical. Internal communications leaked at the worst possible moments. Trust dissolved, allies defected, capital fled, and when the dust settled, nothing remained but unanswered questions. Those who survived understood something immediately. They hadn't lost to a rival. They had violated a rule. The whispers changed tone overnight. No longer curious, no longer dismissive, cautious, reverent. The idea of an unseen authority stopped being a joke and started being a certainty. Not a man, not a group. Something older, something patient. Something that didn't compete, it corrected. Capone retreated again, deeper than before. He had confirmed what he needed to know. The world still responded to pressure, still respected consequence, still feared what it couldn't challenge directly. That fear wasn't weakness. It was stability. But Capone also knew the cost of intervention. Every correction left a trace. Every adjustment introduced variables. The more the world evolved, the less room there was for a single guiding intelligence, no matter how disciplined. The system was approaching a point where it could function entirely on its own. That was the goal he had never spoken aloud. He began withdrawing the final safeguards, allowing localized chaos, permitting failure. The machine had to learn independence. Power that depends on a single mind is fragile. Power that survives its creator is permanent. From a distance, he watched as the underworld adapted without him. New hierarchies formed. New myths replaced old ones. The idea of a hidden architect faded back into abstraction. People returned to fighting each other instead of the shadows. Exactly as intended. Capone felt the familiar sensation of an era ending. He had felt it once before, when prohibition died and took his first empire with it. This ending was quieter. No headlines, no final stand, just a gradual absence. He reviewed the last channels of influence still tied to him, cut them cleanly, no successors, no protégés, no legends to inherit. He had seen what succession did to empires. It made them predictable, weak, vulnerable to time. This empire would have no face. On his final secure connection, Capone watched the world one last time, not with nostalgia, but with assessment. It was louder than ever, more exposed, more convinced it understood itself. That confidence amused him. The world always believed it was smarter than the past. That belief was its greatest weakness. He closed the connection without ceremony. There was no death, no disappearance worth documenting, just an old man stepping fully out of relevance, knowing the design would hold without him. He had done what no criminal, no ruler, no king had ever done successfully. He had left nothing to overthrow. Years later, analysts would still notice strange alignments, sudden stabilizations, collapses that prevented worse disasters. They would argue about coincidence versus control, about whether systems naturally balance themselves or if someone once taught them how. They would never agree. And somewhere deep within the infrastructure of the modern world, financial, political, criminal, the echoes of a mind shaped in a darker century would continue to guide outcomes without ever being named. History would continue telling the story of Al Capone as a man who rose fast and fell hard, and that lie would remain his greatest victory. Time passed the way it always does, unevenly. Loud years collapsed into footnotes, while quiet ones reshaped the world without announcement. The absence left behind by Capone's final withdrawal wasn't noticed at first. Systems continued to function. Markets adjusted. Criminal networks expanded and contracted like lungs breathing on their own. To most observers, it looked like stability. To a few, it felt like something holding the structure together had quietly stepped away. The underworld didn't fall apart. That was the unsettling part. Instead, it fractured into smaller, faster, more aggressive pieces. Without a correcting force, ambition surged. Groups took risks they never would have dared before. Violence spiked in places that had been silent for years. Digital operations grew reckless. Attention became currency again. The very behaviors Capone had spent decades suppressing returned, not because the world wanted chaos, but because chaos is what ambition defaults to when restraint disappears. Law enforcement noticed the change before criminals did. The patterns were familiar, almost nostalgic, the kind of messiness that belonged to an earlier era. More arrests, more headlines, more public victories. Politicians celebrated it as progress. Analysts called it a news cycle. No one asked why the old balance had existed in the first place. But some criminals felt it immediately. Veterans who had survived long enough to remember quieter times sensed the difference. Deals felt less reliable. Protections vanished without explanation. The invisible pressure that once kept conflicts contained was gone. They didn't know what had changed, only that something no longer intervened when lines were crossed. They adapted the only way they knew how: faster, louder, greedier, and in doing so, they proved Capone right one last time. From a distance so far removed it barely qualified as involvement, Capone watched the consequences unfold, not with regret, but with confirmation. The system didn't need him anymore, but it also no longer benefited from restraint. That was the cost of autonomy. Freedom always comes with instability. He had known that when he stepped away. Balance enforced by design can only last as long as the design remains unseen. The modern underworld didn't collapse into mythic chaos. It became something worse, predictable again, exposed, measurable, and therefore manageable by institutions that had once been outmatched by its complexity. Arrests became easier, networks easier to map, leaders easier to replace. Crime returned to being something that could be fought instead of something that simply existed. History would call this progress. Capone understood it as regression. He had never believed crime was the enemy. It was a constant like gravity. What mattered was how it was shaped, directed, contained. When left unchecked, it burned itself out and drew attention that harmed everyone involved. The first underworld had learned that lesson too late. The second had forgotten it entirely. Capone had no intention of returning. That chapter was closed, but his curiosity remained. He wanted to know if the world would ever rediscover the value of quiet power on its own, or if it would forever mistake noise for strength. Years passed. Names changed. Technologies evolved again. The myths surrounding hidden architects faded into obscurity, replaced by newer conspiracies better suited to the algorithmic age. Al Capone became a caricature, an image on documentaries, a face on merchandise, a symbol stripped of intelligence and context. The man was gone, the idea misunderstood, and yet fragments of his design persisted. Not intentionally, not consciously, but systems remember what worked. Certain financial safeguards remained oddly resilient. Certain regulatory frameworks continued to function with unusual efficiency. Some criminal networks, inexplicably disciplined, avoided attention generation after generation, as if inheriting an instinct rather than a strategy. Capone had embedded more than influence. He had embedded habits. One analyst, decades later, would describe it in a paper no one read. Some systems appear to have been optimized for stability rather than profit or dominance. Their origin is unclear. That sentence would be ignored, cited once, forgotten. But it was the closest anyone would come to naming the truth. Capone spent his final years in complete irrelevance by choice, not hidden, not guarded, not powerful in any way that mattered to the world. He had stripped himself of leverage deliberately, the ultimate proof that his empire was never about control. It was about design, and design, once complete, doesn't need its creator. He died the way he had lived his second life, quietly, without witnesses who mattered. No obituary worth reading, no mystery worth investigating, just another absence, absorbed by time. The world didn't notice. But long after his name faded completely, the consequences of his philosophy remained. The criminals who survived longest were not the boldest, but the most invisible. The institutions that endured weren't the strongest, but the most adaptable. Power continued migrating away from spectacle toward silence, even as society obsessed over exposure. Capone had not ruled the modern underworld forever. He had taught it how to rule itself. And that was his final irreversible victory. Because the most dangerous legacy isn't a man who refuses to die. It's an idea that never needs to live again to keep shaping the world. And so the story ends the way it always should, without certainty. Because the most unsettling part of this story isn't whether Al Capone survived longer than history admits. It's the idea that power doesn't need a face to exist, and control doesn't need a throne to endure. Empires don't always fall. Sometimes they dissolve into systems so familiar we stop questioning who designed them in the first place. Maybe Al Capone really did die in 1947, broken and forgotten. Or maybe the man disappeared long before his body ever did, leaving behind something far more permanent than fear or reputation. A way of thinking, a method, a quiet understanding of how influence works when no one is looking. Because the world doesn't get cleaner. It just gets better at hiding its mess. And the most dangerous forces aren't the ones screaming for attention. They're the ones patient enough to let time do the work for them. If you enjoyed this story, let me know what you think in the comments. Was this just fiction? Or does it feel a little too believable? And if you want more stories that explore the shadows behind history, power, and control, make sure you're subscribed. Because the truth isn't always buried. Sometimes it's just been waiting